The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai hoki mai kia The Fold e mihi nei, ko Duncan tōku ngā. My guest this week is Irene Gardiner, who is the president of Spada, which is the Screen Producers Guild for New Zealand. Screen producers basically are the production companies that make all kinds of things, but particularly film and television productions here. So like a lot of this stuff gets a bit arcane and you end up having to explain all these different pieces. But the best way to think of them is producers make the thing happen, from money to personnel to working with writers and directors and cinematographers and networks or distributors. Producers are, to my understanding, are the glue that sits in the middle. And, the more I'm around this industry, sort of both observing it and as a participant through our Hexwork Productions, which is our screen production, the more the creativity and the drive and the complete importance of production companies and producers sort of becomes clearer and clearer in my mind. So Irene has got an amazing CV. She's worked in production on dozens of shows, stretching back into the 80s. She basically sort of single-handedly revived TVNZ's internal production from a fairly moribund state in the mid-90s, and in so doing worked on shows like Havoc and Newsboy and Pioneer House and a whole bunch of things which I think were really kind of forward-looking and interesting in that era. She then went on to work at NZ On Screen through its kind of growth, which I think has been, that's a fantastic resource for those who aren't necessarily familiar with it. It helps provide a map into our sort of screen industry, but also really the sort of the taonga of our industry, that a lot of the creations, whether it's episodes or films that exist there and like short biographies of probably thousands of people. So it's a really good way to kind of dive into what we have made as a nation. And she has recently taken on the role of president of Spada. And this interview was actually recorded about 10 days ago. And just yesterday as I speak and last week as you listen to this, I wrote a story about The Pilgrim, which is a script that had been in production and that Spada and the Film Commission sort of went to war over a little bit. It was a really fun story to write, and unfortunately, because of the timing of this interview, it would have been a great thing to discuss with Irene, but there's none of that in there. But I sort of encourage you to go out and search that out. If you search my name and The Pilgrim, you should be able to, or just look for my byline on the spin-off, you should be able to dig it up. But what that story does is really sort of illustrate the complexities of the relationships between producers, between Spada and the various branches and agencies of film and television in New Zealand. I've really tried to kind of explain it as I go along in that piece, and because this is an industry that I think is a fascinating one. It informs and reflects who we are in really crucial ways. There's a huge amount of government participation in it from a funding perspective, but it also, its brightest stars help explain who we are to the whole world. So it's a really, really important thing to get right. So we try and dig into a bunch of that in this conversation, in this kōrero, and I think there is so much complexity there, but it is so important. So hopefully you'll enjoy it too. This is Irene Gardiner on The Fold. Tēnā koe, Irene, and welcome to The Fold.
Kia ora.
I wondered if you could start by explaining to me and our listeners what Spada is and does.
Spada is the Producers Guild. We have a slightly confusing name because where the directors used to be with us, so it was the Screen Producers and Directors Association. Then they went and formed their own group, so we need to try and keep Spada. So we've got a weird name, which is the Screen Production and Development Association, because, producers do development and production. But it's horrendously confusing, and we are just basically the main Screen Producers Guild in New Zealand. And our role is to advocate for our producers and make sure that the screen industry functions as best it can for us.
Which is interesting that word functions, because it does have a reputation for being somewhat dysfunctional at times, and just in the sense that production is actually an enormous and very broad industry that encompasses almost too many things to be in one, which is probably why the directors went off and did their own thing. What made you come and want to go into this famously kind of dyspeptic and hazardous sector and take on this very important but unpaid job?
Well, I've been a producer for years in television, not film, and I've been on the Spada board for about 4 years. And I've learned quite a bit about some of the film stuff I didn't know, some of the policy stuff, kind of overview industry kind of things. And I've found it interesting. And I'm at a point in my life where I have got the time, I can give back to an industry that I really genuinely love and that has been really good to me. I love the screen industry. I love the fact that we make great content here in New Zealand. Yes, it can be tricky because even amongst our own members, we have people wanting different things. Television producers want different things than film producers. And we have to manage that as a guild. But I think we do that, and I think we do a lot of good. And, I guess I'm happy to be a part of that.
What is the current state of the sector at the moment? I mean, there seems to be... it's in such a state of tremendous flux, driven by technology, and we had one of the biggest productions in the world operating here until a bit under a year ago, and suddenly that's gone. And like I say, my perception is that the emotional temperature of the production sector is never super chill at the best of times. How is it right now?
It's a stressful job being a producer because a lot goes wrong, and a lot of what you're doing is that sort of, if A doesn't happen, I'll do B, and if B doesn't happen, I'll do C, and consequence and dealing with things. And of course, thrown into the mix of all of the things you just said, we've had a pandemic for the last 2 years.
Oh, yeah, that thing.
Oh my goodness. I mean, the amount of shoots that had to move, reschedule things, issues with getting people in through the border, a key actor or those kinds of things. That has been unbelievably stressful for people. And actually, Sandy Gildea, our fabulous executive director, that's a lot of what Sandy's done in the last couple of years, is actually just almost like counselling, just keeping people going through all of that, and also working with government agencies and funders to make sure that the specialist funding packages to deal with that were as functional as they could be and were as helpful as they could be. So that has been huge. Although I like to re-quote Rachel Anthony, who runs Greenstone, the production company, who did an RNZ interview, and she said something about how the pandemic was a nightmare for producers and the level of change. But producers, that's actually what we're used to doing. We're used to managing change and dealing with things moving all over the place. So we're resilient, and we did actually rise to that. And, lots of shows got made in New Zealand at a time when they weren't in the world because our COVID response was slightly different. So, that's been huge. But then I guess you get on to just the more general side of things. It's hard in New Zealand because it's a small population country, and therefore it's a small viewership potential country, and it's a small budget country. And those things are just, they are always the scenario that we are in, and we have to work within that. We've been lucky, though, I think, in that over the years we've had generally supportive governments, who've funded NZ On Air, who've funded the Film Commission, who've funded Te Mango Pāo. The money has been there. and, also the screen production grant, obviously, for bigger things. So I don't know. It's not all bad.
No, I dare say it isn't. The thing that, and there's also, in amongst all the change and the chaos, there's also obviously huge opportunity there as well, and new audiences that can be accessed, and the potential for things to go all over the world. And kind of key to unlocking the local side of that is the new public media entity. Now you're on the board of RNZ, and so very much we'll be speaking with
my Spada hat on
here now. But how kind of consulted was the production sector through that? And because I guess the when you come to an inflection point like the merger of RNZ and TVNZ, what that does is change the range of available outcomes quite radically. From there could be a lot more money and a lot more opportunity to this thing could actually try and make a lot more itself. I mean, when you were at TVNZ, you oversaw a big expansion in internal productions there, which was great for viewers, but not necessarily, probably, some external producers wouldn't necessarily have loved seeing. Yeah, I bet. So how has that and you were also on the board assessing the case for that entity as well. So talk through how the production sector has interacted with that process.
Well, actually, it's been a good process. Tracy Martin's been a really good chair. And we did both verbal consultations, but also wrote quite a significant written document of input into it, which I thought was a pretty good document from us. In fact, I think they told us they thought it was a very good document from us. And it is a little tricky for me to talk about because obviously RNZ is part of it. And from that perspective, our chair would normally speak about that. But in a way, wearing my two different hats, the desire is not hugely different. I mean, wearing my RNZ hat, we just want it to be done really, really well and for the best bits of RNZ not to suffer in any negative way. And wearing my Spada hat, we just want it to be done really, really well and for local production not to be hurt in any way so that there's not any unintended consequences, there's no fish hooks. And that is the key, is that it's funded properly. We don't know that yet till the budget. And that it's executed really, really well. And if those things happen, it should be great. The change where sort of the equivalent amount of NZ on air money to what TVNZ might have expected to get is likely to now go directly to the new entity, and NZ on air will just exist to fund other operators, not the new entity. That's an interesting one.
So that's obviously a potential outcome. Do you think that is a likely outcome?
I think it is fairly likely from how they've talked so far. And that's one I could actually argue that both ways. I'm not totally sure. I think it will probably be fine. I think that's going to be something to keep an eye on. And
that would be very sort of back to the future in terms of the commissioning power of the state networks being far more sort of centralised than it has in the past. It also is a bit existentially challenging for New Zealand on air, which I think has also, particularly in the last few years, done very well in terms of how it interacts between the networks and audience change and production sector.
Yeah, and I as I say, I think I could probably argue it both ways, but I think as long as the new entity, I hate calling it that, but we don't have a name yet.
It's so annoying.
As long as it's good and it's really operating with the spirit of public media, a modern public media thing, then it should work because they will spend the money on the right kinds of productions. But I think that's something the production community will need to keep quite a close eye on.
So the thing that I actually wrote about this recently in the aftermath of the Netflix results because the big Netflix result was that they basically stopped growing, dead in their tracks, and there is, they were appropriately punished for that by the share market. But on some level, that was the share market saying, "We think you might be done growing, or certainly done growing as fast as you have been." Which the sort of flow on of that is maybe that period where the huge migration to streaming from linear television is, if not over, it's just not going to be as fast or as, you won't get these big chunks the way it was, and maybe the sort of, we'll live with a continuation of linear at its particular scale and a continuation of streaming at its particular scale, but there won't be that just massive step change like we saw for much of the last decade. The sort of freaky thing for both the new public media entity and for the production sector is that a lot of what we've been doing is sort of predicated on the notion that we will eventually be able to do largely what we have done, which is make great TV shows and movies, but just in a different place and for a different audience. But the stat which sort of leapt out at me and that I wrote about was this survey of the total volume of video content that it is being viewed by particularly younger audiences, under 25s, is the amount of it that it's professionally produced, i.e. made by your sector, is around 50% versus sort of 70% plus, which means that user-generated content is about the other half. And the big challenging thing, I think, for this new public media entity, and I think that we as media and the production sector have to think about is, how do we interact with that? Is there a sort of a more porous border that could emerge between the sort of creator community? I think of something like Viva La Dirt League, who I've had on this podcast before, who do very high quality, professionally produced stuff that's purely for and from, effectively, social media. Yeah, how do you think about that sort of new area? Because the whole point of the merger is to go and get that audience that is missing, but are they even gettable?
That's a really good question. It's incredibly challenging because to a degree they're gone. They're on YouTube or whatever. But that is going to be something that the new entity is going to have to wrestle with. It's going to have to find ways to serve and attract children and older young people. And in the end, it kind of does go back to making attractive content and really thinking about that. And, what is likely to get those eyes there and those ears. I just think it is going to be a perpetual challenge because everything has changed, and I just worry that, to a degree we've lost those young viewers. I don't know exactly how to get them back. I think that's going to be a real challenge for the people having to do it. As NZN is doing, as you all know, is doing a review of its children's strategy at the moment.
I think literally right now.
Yeah. And, there's various schools of thought that I've talked about with our various producers because NZN has sort of, who are always quite modern thinking and moving, they're sort of thinking, maybe go where the audiences are, put a little bit of content here, a little bit of content here, a little bit of content everywhere. But then you can go too far in that direction. And if you don't have something like the Hey children's platform that TVNZ On Demand does, or, you don't have hardly any actual linear children's TV shows, then you've maybe gone too far because you sort of maybe need the content everywhere. I'm talking specifically about children's, which is actually slightly different from what you're talking about because you're talking about younger people generally and their viewing habits.
The thing all joins up, though.
But yeah, it does because it's when you capture them. And there's also that thing that do people come back just because they're older and they're different and they want different things? I think about myself and that I, as a younger person, never listened to RNZ, nothing. And now I never listen to anything else. So what happened there?
But you
I got old.
Yeah, The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
When I try and imagine that journey for, my kids are age 8 to 21, I don't think it is possible. And to be honest, my 21-year-old watches Breakfast in Shorten Street now. TVNZ would be thrilled to hear that, I'm sure. But I think she's weird. Certainly the data says that she's the aberrant one, and that the vast majority of them are much more likely to be on TikTok and on YouTube. And fundamentally, when you're on TikTok and YouTube and Netflix, you're in a place where the total amount of New Zealand content that is there is a tiny fingernail-sized fragment of the big body, and it's not surfaced in the natural way that the old, New Zealand programming was prime time, was front and centre. It was 6 till 7:30 p.m. You couldn't avoid it. And I guess that's where I think probably government regulation, or at the very least a sort of a stern look at the tech companies has to come into things. Does Spada have a view on how government should deal with the likes of Netflix and YouTube? In some respects that is could you please commission some original local content yourselves?
We very much have a view. We've been lobbying to have either what you suggest, some sort of a local quota, or just a pure revenue thing, as in, if perhaps it's for operators over a certain level of profit in New Zealand, could be as little as 5%. It would be great if it was more. It comes directly back to New Zealand via our funders, NZFC, TMP, NZOA, and back into local content. So there's you could have a hybrid where it's a bit of both. You could have one, you could have the other. But when you consider how much money they make in New Zealand, how they don't really contribute, in the sense of paying tax or having any quota or anything, and how much they've hurt our industry because they've taken eyeballs, which have come from network television, which has affected viewers, which has affected revenue, so on and so forth. So, yeah, we would very much like something to happen in that space. We've been doing a bit of gentle lobbying. Government is there are people working on it in a slightly backroomish sense at the moment. It's not come up high priority, mainly just because the government is so incredibly busy because of that thing we mentioned before, that pandemic thing. But, yeah, it would be great. And, Netflix obviously would have been the prime candidate, although they seem to be having their own issues now. So maybe it would be a bad time to say, hey, can we have 5%?
Well, I mean, I think that the confronting thing for all them is, their profitability went up. It was just their growth went down. So Netflix is obviously fundamentally a very sound business, and it spends what is it?
A lot.
20 billion or so on content a year anyway.
Yeah.
It just doesn't spend any of it it does spend some in New Zealand. There's a show shooting on my street right now. One of us is lying.
And Sweet Tooth. Possibly not in your street. But
No, but the fundamentals is that they are making things here, but they might as well be anywhere. That it's
so far. But that is not to say that there won't be New Zealand commissions at some time. At this stage, it's only been locations, apart from one factual show, David Farrier's show, Dark Tourist.
But Dark Tourist was really... It wasn't a New Zealand production, and it just had a New Zealand host. It was shot all over the world. It was
a New Zealand production company, wasn't it?
Maybe.
Anyway, that it could well happen. And what is already happening, and actually I was going to sort of fit this in somewhere in our talk, for all the challenges, and they are big. One of the really great things at the moment is we are on the threshold of that thing that people have been saying about why isn't New Zealand drama? Why aren't we getting the co-productions? Why aren't we getting to the world? Why aren't we getting New Zealand stories? And we're starting to. And so far it isn't with Netflix. It's with people like Acorn and different people. But, things like Mystic, Under the Vines, Brokenwood Mysteries, what's the one with Lucy Lawless? This My Life is Murder. They're all different types of shows. Some of them are quite formula shows, but they are all international co-productions or sales. I think Brokenwood is co-production, I think, but it's also international sales generated. And that area is really starting to hum. So I think we are on the cusp of something there. So, I don't think it's necessarily that long before there's a New Zealand story, commissioned show, production company on Netflix.
But I guess and that will be a great moment. But fundamentally, and we, just to your point before about, reality TV has actually had a long history of New Zealand formats going to the world, and through Discovery, there's a lot more potential for stuff that's actually made here to go out to it becomes more of a conversation rather than it's either made in New Zealand for New Zealanders or in New Zealand for overseas audiences. I think there's growth there. I guess the thing that when that show comes along, that will be one show, and
not necessarily.
Well, no, obviously it'll be the first. But if you think about the scale of what is made here in drama and comedy and factual and so on, versus the amount of attention that has gone to these overseas platforms, I sort of wonder if I certainly think, because some of this is actually just a surfacing problem. Like on YouTube, there is a huge volume of New Zealand content. All of our series are there as well that we make for the spin-off. But the problem is that YouTube, the algorithm just surfaces whatever it thinks you're into. Hopefully it's not crazy conspiracy theories and so on, but sometimes it is. The incentive which I wonder about is because we've gone from distribution being effectively a solved problem and it's really a sorting by schedule to distribution being a very hard thing for the producers of content. So, and yet YouTube has a million nudges it can do. It can, that's largely what its business is prompting you to watch the next thing or what happens when you open the app. There is room for them to say, as part of a please don't regulate us kind of situation, here's $10 million worth of inventory, give that to New Zealand in air, and they can package that up with some of their productions that could promote to push to other platforms or could surface videos more readily.
And again, there's different views on the thing of asking YouTube or Netflix or Amazon or Apple or whomever to contribute to the New Zealand industry. Some people have a fear of it and they go, ooh, no, we don't have enough might, it'll put them off.
I think that's an old argument, that's done.
And the other argument is actually they're expecting it. They're waiting for it. And as it's actually in their interest to give you something as a good corporate citizen who is a part of that New Zealand screen ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Than have worse things potentially regulated upon them. So I think it is an area that we should be lobbying in. And if anyone from government is listening to this podcast, that would be good.
Cool, Irene.
So, I think it actually would be a significant game changer just to have that extra money. Because money, I'm going slightly in a circle here, but, as you were just kind of saying, we're actually pretty strong in factual television, reality TV, documentary, etc., because that is not the high budget end of our industry. And we do well, and New Zealanders watch those shows less than they did because ratings are lower generally, but still pretty good actually, even on linear. And we sell formats to the world and we sell shows to the world. And actually that part is reasonably healthy despite the challenges. Drama is much, much harder because it's really expensive. And, if you make a lower budget show, you affect that show, the quality of it and how it can compete in the world. And so that is hard for New Zealand producers, and that is the beauty of co-production being, the thing and us getting better at that. But the minute you had more money to put into production via our funding agencies, this big, it's a game changer because you can just do more. And if you can do more, you've got more chance of shows being the one that goes boom and is suddenly the big hit thing around the world. So, yeah. And that kind of brings me to the Screen Sector Review that is going on at the moment and, which is also looking into this the Screen Production Grant. And what I guess I'm sort of slightly presupposing because we're not at the stage of doing our written submission yet, and we'll get a working group to do that, and they will be people who are more intimately familiar with the exact bits and pieces of the film policy that surrounds all of that than I am. But the things that I kind of think in an overview sense the balance between New Zealand being used as an international location and New Zealand stories with New Zealand IP copyright being made and going to the world isn't always as good as it could be. And that's something that a little bit of fine-tuning of the current system could potentially fix, be it putting a cap on the international money, be it putting some provisos, you must use X number of New Zealand actors, you must use X directors, writers, heads of department. There's various things we could do just to tweak it slightly to fix the balance, because while I'm not in any way suggesting that it isn't important to the screen industry to have New Zealand as a location for international shoots, because that makes enormous amounts of money for New Zealand, some of which helps the screen industry, huge training ground, experience, all of the good things that brings. But you don't want it to overshadow the other bit where we're actually telling New Zealand stories, because that's the cultural bit, which is just as important as the financial bit. And actually, even if you don't care culturally, there's a financial aspect because it's New Zealand IP, intellectual property. So there's work to be done there. It slightly bothered me when The Power of the Dog was doing really, really well internationally. And the Film Commission did a really good job of promoting New Zealand off the back of that. And that was actually quite impressive. But it worried me slightly in that you could get a message from that of, come here, use our locations. We're here for that, not because that wasn't a New Zealand story.
No.
It was Jane, who's fabulous, and it was, it did really well. Great New Zealand crews, locations. But, we've got stories to tell, and I think that's important. That was a long answer.
No, but it's and I'm really glad, and I think you kind of canvassed how complex these issues are, because when we talk about the production sector, we are talking about something that that sort of fundamental cultural value of it is, which is what binds us together in an era where we're effectively curating our own realities on our phones and screens at any given time. And we don't have those kind of the glue that was. A lot of it was media and was productions historically, and when that phenomena doesn't penetrate as many people's minds as it formerly did, it feels like we're in danger of losing something quite important in the process. And I'm sure that would be what the production sector would say. But it does kind of go back to what we were talking about before, is unless you can, it's all very well, like it becomes a form of cultural busy work if we're just making these beautiful New Zealand stories and we just can't get enough people to watch them for them to make any kind of ultimately financial sense, even cultural sense. Because a beautiful thing that is made that doesn't find an audience, there's a tragedy to that as well.
Yeah, I agree. And again, that's something where, if I talk to our different producer members, I'd get slightly different views, because some people think it's enough that the beautiful thing gets made.
Really?
Yeah, they do. Whereas I come from a slightly more commercial background, being, a television producer in that world, and I find it difficult as, what we used to call a broadcaster, to think that the thing that I've made isn't being viewed by very many people. That kind of bothers me. So yeah, I think, this is going to be the challenge for the new public media entity, is it's going to be trying to do, thoughtful, intelligent, entertaining, good quality content, but it's going to have to do that in ways and using technology and promotion that means people watch it, because otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah, and I think that you're sort of giving, it's a bit of a cop-out to me, this idea that just making it's enough and it's someone else's job to get it watched, or even if it doesn't happen, well, at least we made it. I don't think that's enough.
There's a truth in that some content is made for a niche, and it's never going to have an enormous numbers of people, but it still has a value.
Yeah, and you can sort of feel the heat coming out of the community when it gets seen that way.
You don't expect, a really high quality current affairs style documentary to necessarily rate, what Dancing with the Stars rates. And that's fine. But within reason. I mean, if you're making things that cost money and almost no one's looking at them, then what is the point?
And you need to have a sort of a baseline expectation. But that's where I think that, you know, the point I was making earlier about the distribution being solved thing, like, some of what, if you were to have a kind of, you know, obviously Australia's just been through this thing with journalism where it's, you know, with the ACCC has very strongly encouraged the tech platforms to make settlements with news producers in Australia, and you know,
and that's beginning here as well.
Yeah, it's grinding along, but fundamentally there's a version of that which could be with a Netflix and a YouTube and you know, even potentially like a TikTok, for example, that force them to come to some kind of settlement with the local industry that wasn't necessarily about funding going to New Zealand On Air, though that would be nice, but was also about like commitments to, you know, like radio did with its quotas for New Zealand music.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, anything would help. Money would help. A quota would help. Even, I guess it ties into a quota, but sort of what you were talking about surfacing, you know, about algorithm type work, just to get what New Zealand content there is.
I mean, these are advertising platforms. Just give them some inventory.
That's not my area of particular expertise, but that, you know, the new entity is actually going to have people who have that expertise who can try and work out where do you put stuff and how do you get it to come to people. I mean, that's one of the things I know that there's different thoughts on the children's strategy that NZ On Air is doing at the moment, but that's one thing I would really credit NZ On Air. They have, you know, they do those where the audiences are surveys and they keep up to date. They actually have been very good about trying to keep up with technology and viewing change. But it's hard, you know, it is incredibly challenging. I mean, possibly sounds naive, but I still think if you make really great content, that's a pretty good starting point, because if it's really great, people will find it.
Well, yes, but and also whatever marketing you do will be more effective, because when people come to find the thing, they'll talk about it.
That's a little grievance that some of our producers have got at the moment, is that the networks, I guess because like everyone's stretched these days, don't seem to be putting as much resource into promoting local production as they used to. And that's something we need to have a little look at, just why that is and whether we could get that a bit healthier.
Well, yeah, and I think that, you know, that sort of certainly feels true. And obviously I have a particular proximity through the promotional side that you know, as well through the spin-off. But I think New Zealand On Air could solve for some of this by sort of having funding come contingent with obligations. And in fact, you know, you could ask them, but obviously they pay a license fee. Well, the license fee could be held in escrow so long as they hit particular targets, which were in some ways made flesh by an amount of promotion for these shows.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an area that needs a little bit of looking into with the networks and NZ On Air.
So historically, the production sector had, and I think this was true of the networks, it was true of the whole of the media, it had this glorious idea of one big audience and we were all in one big melting pot. Really, it was a big Pākehā audience, largely. And that everyone bears some responsibility for that. And I think there has been a collective sense of we've got to start solving for this very quickly, and it's not an easy thing to solve, and it's not just a money problem. It's a whole bunch of things. But we've seen in recent years that Māori and Pacific and even latterly Pan-Asian programming has increased. You know, the amazing work that Attitude do around programming for New Zealanders with disabilities and so on. Is the sector kind of, how has that impacted the sector, and is there a danger that it kind of is characterised as sort of niche programming as opposed to being big and broad?
Yeah, it has to be both. I think we've made incredible strides in those areas in the last couple of years, and I think the funding agencies can take some credit for that, and to a degree the networks, although probably it was led more by the funding agencies. And it's certainly a lot better than it was. But there is still a way to go, and I like that expression, you know, we've come too far not to go further, because I think it's really important that we do. But you make a good point. I think the the targeted, the niche shows have a value, and actually they sort of relate to what we were talking before about that they don't have the huge numbers, but they have the right people and the numbers that they need. But it is also that thing of just making different ethnicities, different abilities, obvious in everything, in all of the programming. And I think that's the bit that we are starting to do better, but there's still work to be done. Having said that, isn't Shortland Street good about all of those kinds of things?
Well, but hasn't it always been good?
Shortland Street is a little miracle.
Yeah.
And I don't know that your daughter is an outlier. I think young people are still finding Shortland Street. It might not be at, 7 o'clock at night on TV2.
Well, and I don't think it's the same volume as it once was. You use 500,000 people a day.
It's still pretty good, and it's a great little show.
It is a great little show, and it performs so many functions, and, long may it continue. But I think, one of the things that I'm gratified by, I just before you arrived, I was catching up with Joe Damon, who's been a previous guest on The Fold, has a production company, West Park, which is working with a lot with Māori television, coming up with formats and creating really, really great productions. They are on a budget, but I think, having, and obviously Bailey's done tremendous things with Pango, and there's a lot more besides. I think there is it's not just kind of the representation on camera or even behind camera, but I think that the more that the production sector can start to represent at even like an ownership level, the communities that it's serving, and let those ideas grow into bigger productions and roam overseas. I think there'll be great things come from that too. I
really admire, you mentioned Bailey Mackey, who runs Pango Productions. I really admire Bailey's work because he is very, very good at taking Māori topics, Māori themes, Māori people, but making broad appeal television out of that.
Absolutely.
And he's the master of that. And, the thing that we shouldn't forget when we're talking about particularly Māori and Pacifica, but Asian as well actually now, some of the things that have done best for us internationally, films, etc., that's what they've been. They've had Māori themes. Well, Whale Rider is one of our most successful exported screen pieces.
And that's what's unique about this country.
And actually a couple of people have said to me, working on co-productions, things like The Gulf, I think is it German co-production people? And there's some Māori content, a little bit of cultural stuff, a little bit of spirituality. And the international people got more of that. Whereas historically in New Zealand, we might have kind of gone, ooh, maybe that'll be a bit off-putting. But it's interesting because international people, that's the bit that's cool, and different and interesting. So there you go.
Well, there's a lot in that, and you've just come on as president, so good luck to you. But we'll be watching this space, and I think that fundamental, like this, that's such a recurring theme on this podcast, is this idea that the tech giants basically will come to your country. They barely know you exist. You're just a revenue line. And the cultural impact and what that does to us as a people and our ability to understand one another is enormous. And I think that it's absolutely a time when, for us as a country, but also the companies are receptive to this too. Like they know that they didn't get into the business just to kind of rapaciously pillage us. So I think that hopefully there are people from government listening, and certainly organisations like yours speaking to and encouraging them to kind of go from this very blunt force trauma area to something more sophisticated.
And funnily enough, I just remember the thing I thought of before that then flickered straight out of my head. At some point in the future, they probably will end up being taxed. There is work being done on that. And see, in a way, that would work less well for the screen industry because that'll just come into the general tax take. Whereas if they contribute specifically, that is actually of more value to us.
So, at the same time, just if the overall tax take is big,
we could have some of it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And if it's...
I'd take anything at this point.
Well, but it also just makes the sector more visible, right, to the government through revenue. So, you'll take anything.
I feel like we've talked a lot about the problems of the industry. I feel like I should sort of finish by saying we do make some really lovely screen content here in New Zealand.
That's true. That's the curse of the fold. It's almost always what's hard at the moment. But you're absolutely right. And the thing is, the whole reason that this podcast exists, the spin-off exists as a website, it's founded on television. Let's remember that. And that the whole production sector exists is because our stories, are fantastically told by the production sector, and it's really about setting them up to succeed and find an audience, and that's the job.
It is.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Thanks so much, Irene.
Thank you.
The Fold is brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network, together with Vodafone. It was hosted by Duncan Grieve, produced by T.I. Butler, with production management by Rachel LaRue and series production by Jane Yee. To find out how Vodafone can help you reach your personal and business potential, visit vodafone.co.nz.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spin-off Podcast Network.